So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to panel 3 on the history of magazines. My name is Ana Figueiras, and I will be this session's chair. Before we start, I would like to remind everyone of some technical details. Please keep your cameras and microphones switched off to allow a better experience for everyone. When their turn comes, speakers will receive a notification to allow the camera to be turned on. Every presenter has 20 minutes to present, and at the end of all presentations, the authors will address your questions. Questions will be received through Zoom, through this Zoom chat option, and to use this, just look for the icon at the bottom of your screen. All sessions will be recorded by the Conference Organization Committee, and the presentations will be made available online, unless otherwise specified. So please do not record the session yourselves. You can record your presentation, but we don't recommend since we are already doing it. The first presenter will be Catherine Staub from Drake University, who will be talking to us about the seminal role of farming magazines in the 20th century.
Good morning, everybody. I had this all set to share my PowerPoint, and now it is not giving me option to share my PowerPoint.
Beautiful. Just 1 minute.
Catherine, just as always. Beautiful. Sorry, I have to say this.
Do you want me to just share my entire desktop rather than just the PowerPoint?
Are you having?
Well, earlier it allowed me to share just the PowerPoint rather than my whole desktop, but I'll just share my desktop so we can get started.
Okay.
Carrega em cima.
Okay. Can everyone hear me and see the PowerPoint that I have on my desktop?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. Well, good morning to those of you in the States, and good afternoon to our hosts. Thank you so much for putting on this wonderful conference. So for the next 15 or so minutes, I'm going to briefly overview research regarding the seminal role of 20th century farming magazines. My research points to 8 lasting impacts of 20th century farming magazines, 3 on farming itself and 5 influences on the magazine. So I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on each one of those, but first I do want to point out a couple of things regarding the influence and prevalence of 20th century farming magazines to underscore the impacts that I found in my research. So researchers noted that during the 20th century, farm magazines were really one of 3 major sources of information for farmers. The other 2 include other farmers and extension agents. Also, other researchers found that farm magazines were farmers' only source of sustained journalistic coverage of agricultural issues, rural life, and the business of farming. So underscoring the importance of these magazines. Looking at the beginning of the 20th century, in 1913, a study showed that 66% of respondents reported that they were, quote, influenced by agricultural magazines. And that influence really carried through. There was another study in 1965 that showed that farm households received an average of 6.7 farm magazines. So there's a lot more research that underscores underscores that, but I wanted to start off with that so that you see that this isn't just a like quaint little niche area that really didn't have any impact, but in fact it did. So let me, without further ado, get into farming practices. So broad brush, farming practices changed dramatically over the 20th century. At the beginning of the, and my research focused on the United States. There is research into farm magazines in Europe. My research did focus on the United States. So at the beginning of the 20th century in the United States, there were nearly 6 million farms, and about 40% of the US population lived on farms. And most of these were small family operations. By the close of the 20th century, fewer than 0.6% of the US population were farmers, and most of these farms were massive corporate-owned entities. Throughout that, obviously, there was extensive change in the farming industry, and farm magazines both reflected those changes as well as influenced and led those changes. One theme I found across my research is that agricultural publications and their editors were really credited with urging better farming methods. They were always, they weren't simply reporting on what farmers were already doing. They were urging farmers to improve their farming methods, to promote education, promote the use of resource so that there could be further progress in the farming industry. One study I looked at actually found that ag publications were ahead of ag colleges by 5 to 15 years in terms of the transitions they were recommending and the subject matter that they were covering, which is pretty remarkable. One specific example, as early as 1967, farm magazines were addressing the topic of big agriculture or big ag, corporate agriculture. It really wasn't until the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s, that farm production was becoming more concentrated. And yet these magazines were, as early as the late 1960s, projecting that that was what was coming. And they were looking at this in terms of projecting farm debt really increasing and the necessity of changing over to corporate farming in order to have a way of handling that debt. Farm magazines also reflected the changes in farming. Early in the 20th century, the content of farm magazines was rooted in the family farm. And by the late 1960s, that portion of the content dealing with the family farm was removed from the magazines. And really, according to the grandson of E.T. Meredith, who was the founder of Successful Farming and one of the magazines that I looked at for this paper, said that they made the decision to make Successful Farming a farm management magazine, and that's really what it remains today. It's not a family farm. It was no longer a family farm magazine. It really was a farm management magazine that was dealing with the corporate aspect of farming. So content in traditional farming magazines really started focusing on pesticides and herbicides in the mid-1970s. As farmers expanded their operations, they needed information about pesticides and herbicides, which were commonly used at that time in order to increase crop yield, reduce crop losses because of problems that they were having. But at the same time, there was public concern about the environment and pollution was rising. So traditional farming magazines were largely omitting this. So this gave rise to farm magazines specifically launched to deal with alternative farming practices. So one of them that I don't have pictured here is Acres USA. It was launched in 1971. As a, quote, comprehensive guide to sustainable agriculture, and it really applied to more large-scale farms. Mother Earth News was founded in response to the problems that its founder, John Shuttleworth, saw in agribusiness, which is what was being promoted in the traditional farming magazines. And he really wanted to encompass an entire lifestyle that addressed environmental problems. And these were really successful. Mother Earth News, 5 years after it was founded, enjoyed a circulation of 250,000, up from its initial subscription list of just 147. But there was actually Organic Farming was one organic farm magazine that was launched prior to the 1970s. Its founder, J.I. Rodale, was keenly interested in natural agricultural practices. And so he experimented first on his own farm and saw improvements to the land as well as improvements to his own health and well-being. And so he launched Organic Gardening and Farming. In May 1942, he optimistically printed about 14,000 copies of the magazine and sent those out in hopes that he would get subscriptions, and he got 12. But fortunately, he persisted, and he eventually found interest from gardeners, primarily victory gardeners in the early days, and grew the circulation to just over 250,000 by 1960 and to 1.3 million by 1980. And it really dealt with smaller farmer operations as opposed to Acres USA, which was bigger farms. Another aspect of farm magazines that I've delved into quite a bit in some other research as well is gender stereotypes, particularly in traditional farm magazines. That's where the focus of my research in regards to gender stereotypes really focused. So traditional farm magazines, as you can see, here's a selection of covers from both the Farm Journal and Successful Farming through the years, starting in 1927 and going through the cover on the far side is from the 1980s. And the covers are reflective of the internal content as well. This was really, traditional farming magazines portrayed farming as a masculine endeavor. The only exception would be during World War II. During that time, rural women were asked to take on food production roles for the war cause. And so farm magazines highlighted and promoted those efforts. For instance, they did a story, The Thorpe's Farm Without Manpower, and it states, quote, "The fact that the Thorpe farm has remained in full production can be entirely attributed to the work done by Laura," the focus of the article, "her sister and their mother." But other than that World War II period of time, it was assumed, no matter what the actual reality was on the farm, that the male was the head of the farm, he was the farmer. Early in the 20th century, farm magazines had large sections dedicated to women, but they included articles like How to Can Like a Champion, Easier Upkeep for Men's Summer Suits, and 7 Budget Recipes. So it was very much focused on home, keeping up the home, taking care of children, and that sort of thing. So shifting to look at 20th century farm magazines' influence on the magazine industry. So service journalism really, I would say, had a grounding in both Meredith Corporation, that I'll get to in a moment, the publisher for Successful Farming, but also more specifically Successful Farming and other farm magazines themselves. So service journalism prides itself on offering its readers practical advice, how-to information, some news and trends, but as it can be applied to the reader's daily life. As James Autry, a former editor-in-chief for Better Homes and Gardens, defined it, journalism that goes beyond the delivery of pure information to include the expectation that the reader will do something as a result of the reading. And this is what these farm magazines were all about. In the words of the current editorial director of Successful Farming, who's been with the magazine for decades, Successful Farming was there to educate, to teach, and to share new practices that farmers needed. They've always been a practical guide to farmers in the field. So you'll see some snippets from magazines throughout the 20th century. And it's all, how to make farming more profitable. The bad news for pests gave strategies for pest control, why and exactly how you rotate your crops. The center one is some illustrations for how to properly hook up a plow to a tractor. So the expectation for the bulk of the magazines, while there were early in the 20th century, there were entertaining sections where there would be works of fiction and games and jokes and things like that. The bulk of these magazines throughout the 20th century were focused on the expectation that farmers needed this information so that they could take some direct actions that would improve the output of their farms when they finished reading the magazine. These magazines also followed the advertising model that is kind of the bedrock of magazines. And 80% is the number or the percentage of agricultural marketers' media budgets that went to advertising in farm magazines. That is from 1970. So if you're capturing 80% of the marketing budget, you definitely know that advertising is absolutely key to what these farm magazines were doing and their business model as a whole. From the very first issue of Successful Farming, ads were included. Certainly agricultural related products. That first one included wagons, dairy separators, seeds, wheat mills, and a luxury art item, a musical organ. And then more recently in the 20th century, farm magazines were promoting tractors, diggers, trucks, etc. And certainly just as with the model is today for virtually any magazine that accepts ads, ads were important, of course, because they generated revenue for the publishers, but also because they then lowered the price so that these farm families could afford the magazines. But it was also, of course, another way for advertisers to get their message to readers and another way for readers to gain new information about the latest products that were available to them on their farms when, especially early in the 20th century, farm families were really isolated from one another. E.T. Meredith, the founder of Successful Farming, made this promise to his readers that if they got a loss by a swindler who advertised in their columns, the swindler would be exposed, but also they would recoup their costs from Meredith Corporation itself. E.T. Meredith, founder of Successful Farming, was so taken with the idea of delivering the best value for his advertisers that he developed an extremely in-depth scorecard test of farming papers where he sent this long test to all his advertisers, asking them on various points to compare their magazine to the competition. But you can also see, as we see today, advertisements for things, in this case, new tractors, were right next to editorial about new equipment that you need on the farm. So certainly it helped propel that model that is still part of, an integral part of most magazine business today. I would also say that magazines as 360 brands, however you want to phrase it today, really had its roots in farm magazines from the 20th century as well. These are some examples of things that Successful Farming did to really extend the brand beyond the print magazine itself. So they had a fashion catalog that they sent out. They developed a rural schools service bureau that provided information to rural schools and had what you see in the middle here is an example of one of the monthly lessons. They would have lessons for the little kids, the middle grades, the upper grades, and each aspect of the lesson would ask students to refer to the most recent issue of the magazine. They published home plans that they sent out. This is a letter from the editor to anybody who purchased the home plans. And then they would feature some of those select results in the magazine. And then Successful Farming was one of the first magazines to launch a website. In 1995, they launched agricultural.com, which was the first for an ag magazine, but one of the first for magazines as well. So truly understanding they had to touch their audience in a variety of ways. Publishing houses were also launched because of farming magazines. So this is E.T. Meredith. He launched Successful Farming in 1902. Fruit, Garden and Home was then launched by E.T. Meredith in 1922, which by 24 became Better Homes and Gardens, which was the launch of Meredith Corporation, which after their acquisition of Time Inc. is the largest magazine publisher in the United States. Other examples of the influence of farm magazines in terms of creating publishing dynasties would be a smaller example, Rodale, which came from that organic farming that Rodale started. And there's additional influence as well. And I would say the final area is content marketing. This is a specialty of mine, but I'll only touch on it really briefly here. John Deere's The Furrow, which was actually launched in 1895 and has been in continuous publication since, is noted widely as the first example of content marketing, where it provides key information for farmers, but also is a way for them to remain really connected to John Deere, the publisher. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for your presentation. And next we have Sharon Bloyd Peshkin from Columbia College, Chicago, presenting From Marginal to Mainstream, How Vegetarian Magazines Affected the American Diet.
Sorry, I was having trouble getting myself unmuted there. Thanks. Let me just do a screen share here. And you should be able to see that now. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. So, yeah, this is another sort of case study of a magazine in the context of culture and history at its times and change. And it's vegetarian magazines and sort of their relationship to the American diet. Why is this not? Hold on a second. Sorry. All kinds of slide issues today. Here we go. So in 1970, Paul Obis, a nurse in Chicago, had an epiphany while eating a hamburger in a local Burger King. A lot of people in this world don't eat meat. How many cows will I eat in my lifetime? He asked himself. I don't have to contribute to this. But it wasn't obvious what he should do next. There were few vegetarian cookbooks or convenience foods. Obis placed signs in the windows of local health food stores that said, "Vegetarians, let us unite," and assembled a group of vegetarians who ate potluck meals together. Obis then wrote an article he titled, "Being a Vegetarian is Never Having to Say That You're Sorry to a Cow," which no editor accepted. So in 1974, he created a 4-page newsletter. He called it Vegetarian Times. Its tagline was a publication for non-meat eaters. He created 300 mimeographed copies, and he delivered it to local health food stores and other locations on his green Schwinn varsity bicycle. And with that, a magazine that charted an emerging movement was born. Oops, I think I went, there we go, sorry. Obis's timing was fortuitous. In the late 1960s and the early 1970s, American youth were challenging traditional forms of authority. Interest in vegetarianism played an important role in the countercultural movement, reinforced by numerous spiritual, environmental, and ethical concerns. Young people who were drawn to Zen Buddhism and to yoga adopted a meatless diet as part of their spiritual path. Francis Moore Lepay's best-selling Diet for a Small Planet, which was published in 1971, linked meat eating to environmental degradation and food scarcity, motivating people with environmental and ethical concerns to give up meat. Peter Singer's Animal Liberation in 1975 galvanized and expanded the animal rights movement. As part of a general overthrow of conventional arrangements, communes and other intentional communities were founded during this period, many of them embracing a vegetarian diet. Still, among the general public, vegetarians were subjected to stereotyping as hippies and health food nuts. Being considered odd for eating a meatless diet was not a social stigma to many of those who adopted the lifestyle. It was a badge of pride. Still, lack of acceptance could be isolating for vegetarians when they were invited to food-based gatherings with non-vegetarian friends and family, and all vegetarians were frustrated by lack of access to recipes, to restaurant meals, and to sound nutritional advice. Moreover, vegetarians in the United States were relatively small in number, and they were spread out geographically. Vegetarian Times helped connect them during the early years and rapidly expanded in size and in reach. 3 years after its debut as a 4-page mimeograph, the magazine was bi-monthly with 56 pages and 10,000 readers. And back in that day, 10,000 issues. During this period, the influence of vegetarians extended beyond those who adopted a meatless diet, leading to some backlash. The meat industry sought to portray vegetarianism as extreme and even unhealthy. Most nutritionists also discouraged vegetarian diets, particularly for children. And physicians who received little education about nutrition remained skeptical that a plant-based diet was adequate for good health. Against this backdrop, Vegetarian Times was essential reading. It provided articles documenting the many arguments against eating meat: environmental, agricultural, animal rights, and nutritional, and correcting the misconceptions spread by the meat industry and uninformed health professionals. It also published dining guides, recipes, and advice on cooking and on traveling as a vegetarian. It wasn't the only vegetarian magazine of its time, but Vegetarian Times, as a consumer magazine with a rapidly growing subscriber base, quickly became the must-read of a growing movement. It is worth noting that vegetarianism didn't emerge in the 1970s. In fact, its roots in the United States go back to the mid-19th century, when it was embraced along with other social movements related to moral reform, such as temperance, women's suffrage, and abolitionism. In 1893, vegetarians met as part of the World's Congress at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. "Live on vegetables, men and women who eat no meat open a World's Congress," declared the Chicago Daily Tribune in 1893. Still, vegetarians were regarded as dietary fringe characters, and in many ways they were. Criticized as half-crazed, sour-visaged infidels and food cranks, they sought to establish vegetarian cities and proclaimed puritanical views of not only diet, but also physical pleasure. The blandness of vegetarian meals at the time did not help either. By the beginning of the 20th century, advocates of a vegetarian diet emphasized evidence of a meatless diet's health benefits more than moral claims. But during the first half of the 20th century, some early leaders of the movement died of communicable diseases, undercutting their arguments for the health benefits of a meatless diet. Meat gained nutritional and social status during the 2 world wars, when they were the centerpiece of army rations, and civilians with means demonstrated their ability to afford and obtain meat during wartime. The meat and potatoes nutritional doctrine of the 1950s in America cemented this decline. And yet, there was still an undercurrent of vegetarianism in the United States. There was the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which included the belief that a well-balanced vegetarian diet that avoids the consumption of meat will promote vigorous health. Members of the church served as subjects for epidemiological studies on health and vegetarian diets. And there was the American Natural Hygiene Society, for whom a vegetarian diet was one aspect of the pursuit of a healthy lifestyle. But both of these were fairly insular, and most of America was not paying attention. American vegetarians who were not associated with these groups did not have many places to turn for support or for community until the 1970s. This is the vacuum that Vegetarian Times filled. It provided its readers with motivation, with practical information, and with validation. As author Ellen Sue Spivak wrote in the October 1975 issue, and this is a quote, "The more I embodied vegetarianism, the more I realized that it was not merely a diet. It became a spiritual / ethical / compassionate / political / health issue. In short, it became my lifestyle. I could no longer separate my vegetarianism from other aspects of my life. I realized that no matter which of the schools of vegetarian thought a person came in by, or which group he or she belonged to, they all seemed to embody their vegetarianism as a way of life," end quote. Whereas members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church embraced a vegetarian diet because of their religion, these new vegetarians were finding in their diet something like a spiritual path and a community. During the decade after Vegetarian Times was launched, numerous vegetarian organizations emerged and gained national attention, including the North American Vegetarian Society in 1974, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals in 1980, and the nonprofit Vegetarian Resource Group in 1982. Each of those also had a magazine. The North American Vegetarian Society launched Vegetarian Voice in 1975. The Vegetarian Resource Group launched Vegetarian Journal in 1982. These were association publications. They were distributed to members of these organizations, and as such, they reached an audience of already card-carrying vegetarians and vegans. They were essential to the ecosystem of vegetarian publications, but they were unseen by non-members. They were invisible at newsstands and checkout counters, unlike the consumer magazine, Vegetarian Times. In the early 1980s, Vegetarian Times reflected the breadth of interests of the vegetarian community, regularly publishing stories about health, nutrition, agriculture, and the environment. It had an edge to it too, exploring controversial topics such as whether a macrobiotic diet could help the body fight cancer, or whether homeopathic remedies could treat illnesses. It regularly applauded or criticized organizations, institutions, and individuals for their food policy and for their treatment of animals and of the environment. The covers of the magazine primarily featured people who were profiled or figured prominently in stories, such as actress Betty Buckley, entertainer Kinky the Clown, marathoner and bodybuilder Geki Olenikova, actor William Shatner, and of course, Fred Rogers, America's favorite neighbor. These were the celebrities, athletes, and activists who exemplified what vegetarians could be: healthy, successful, influential, and admirable. The covers of the magazine reveal an evolution from an alternative lifestyle publication to a food magazine. Throughout the 1990s, high-quality food photography on the covers made the case that vegetarian food can be just as appealing and as satisfying as meat-based meals, and people were relegated to a small box in the upper left corner. The food was bountiful, seasonal, and beautiful. As Obis wrote in issue 155 in July of 1990, the magazine was on newsstands next to Cooking Light and Bon Appetit, and it needed, he said, quote, to look as good as they do and to show that vegetarian food is as attractive as non-vegetarian food. And by the 1990s and the early 2000s, it was all about the food. These covers reflect the transformation of the magazine as a whole. Over these years, it shifted from exposing the hazards of a meat-based diet to supporting a vegetarian diet with recipes and with service pieces, meaning articles that help readers accomplish their goals. It went from arguing for the health, ethical, and environmental benefits of a vegetarian diet to supporting the growing number of Americans who already accepted the benefits of a meatless diet and needed help in practicing one. As the magazine grew in circulation, eventually surpassing 250,000, mainstream advertisers did start to view the magazine as large enough of a market segment to warrant advertising to them, as the editors had suggested years earlier. The magazine assumed that readers included new vegetarians, near vegetarians, and people just cutting back on meat, who came to the magazine for a variety of reasons, and the magazine sought to serve them all while avoiding putting any of them off. By 1990, ads for national brand supplements and cruelty-free cosmetics predominated, along with organic and natural foods such as Lundberg rice and Fantastic Foods. And by 2000, the ads were predominantly for products related to cooking and health, including a large array of dietary supplements, mass market vegetarian foods, and even mattresses and mixers. Vegetarians still comprised a small percent of the American population. A variety of surveys suggest that in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, between 1% and 2% of Americans were vegetarian. And by the end of the century, the percentage may have increased to between 4% and 6%. And I say may because the term vegetarian started to get redefined during those years, but their influence surpassed their size. By the turn of the century, vegetarians and meatless meals were gaining widespread acceptance. This is evidenced by the explosion in vegetarian offerings at restaurants, vegetarian foods in supermarkets, and the US Department of Agriculture's 2000 ruling that the federal school lunch program would allow the protein component to come from non-meat sources. Vegetarian magazines, including Vegetarian Times, contributed to this widespread acceptance beyond the reach of association publications distributed only to true believers. Their writers and their readers influenced the variety of meals served in restaurants and on airplanes, the advice provided by the nation's dietitians about the nutritional adequacy of a meatless diet, and awareness of the environmental and ethical consequences of the mainstream meat-based American diet. It accomplished this by going mainstream, shedding its more provocative content and catering to the growing number of people working to eat less meat, as well as the advertisers seeking to reach them. And in some ways, the magazine's very success led to its undoing. Having successfully made the case that vegetarian meals were healthy and tasty, and that vegetarians were normal people, and having ridden the wave of non-vegetarians cutting back on meat for health and environmental reasons, the magazine no longer served a specific purpose for a specialized audience. Readers no longer needed it for nutritional advice, for recipes, for ethical and environmental arguments, or for access to one another. And advertisers no longer needed it to reach those consumers. Vegetarian Times was on the winning side of the battle against the standard American meat and potatoes diet, but it was in some ways a casualty of its own success. And thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Sharon. Now I have the next presentation will be by Celiana Azevedo from Nova University of Lisbon, who will be sharing with us the work developed with Jorge Pedro Sousa from Fernando Pessoa University on Portuguese magazines during the First Portuguese Republic.
Hey everyone, good afternoon. My name is Celiana Azevedo, and I'm going to do this presentation, my name and name of my colleague, Jorge Pedro Sousa. I'm going to talk about magazines during the First Portuguese Republic. The First Portuguese Republic went from October 1910 to May 1926, and there were only 3 general information magazines during its 16 years. Okay, let's see. It's better. ABC, Revista Portuguesa, Domingo Ilustrado, and Ilustração. The reason why there were so few magazines in this period are related to the fact that the structure of the media market had changed and the public had become interested in more sophisticated magazines. On the other hand, Portugal was going through a period of great political unrest, with an economic crisis and attempts to control the press, and also consequences from the World War I, in which Portugal was indirectly involved. All these aspects have generated an environment not ideal to invest in new media projects. ABC Revista Portuguesa was the first general information illustrated magazine and was published for 11 years between July 1920 and September 1931, and was preceded by an issue that was freely distributed to publicize the magazine, the new magazine in the Portuguese society. ABC reached the new stands around 2 years after the World War I, when Europe and the world were still recovering. And in this moment, Portugal was a rural and impoverished country facing political instability. Graphically speaking, the ABC had colorful covers and the layout could change from number to number. And the internal design of the magazine was composed of 2 or 3 columns, and its pages were full of photos or illustrations. An aspect in which the ABC stood out from other magazines was the fact that almost all the materials published were identified with the author. This reinforces the importance of the journalists who work at ABC. In addition, for example, in addition to the directors, all male, ABC had an impressive number of male collaborators, 92, and that list 12 female collaborators. We can see here some of the photos of the male and all the female collaborators. The magazine always published a wide range of topics, probably aiming to gain a large number of readers, and had an special attention to themes relating to female audience, include at least 3 sections addressed exclusively to them. We can see here As Modas do ABC, Confidências Femininas do ABC, and Histórias das Futilidades Femininas. Here we can read a lot about dresses, hair, tips, how to work or clean your house, which was a very specific subject for the woman from that moment. ABC has always highlighted by artistic aspect and the great dedication to the iconography. This is evident from the very first numbers because it was very difficult to find a page without an illustration or a photo. So it was one of the characteristics of the magazine. Only after 1930, ABC started to use photography as an informative aspect on the covers. Before that, it was photos from beautiful women, but nothing that given information or even a subject that could be developed in the magazine. For example, the edition of 19 of February in 1931 bring as cover theme a piece of a prison in Lisbon, as you can see here. This type of a journalistic approach is close to what we routinely see in magazines all over the world today. But at that time, it was considered very modern and innovative. The narrative style was quite eclectic, but most of the journalistic text were news, reportage, and articles. Among several examples that we can find, we highlight a series of sequential reports about Russia, published in 1926, which led to an amendment on the covers with the logo of the magazine being adapted to ABC, a Portuguese magazine in Russia. It was signed by the Repórter X, a famous ABC collaborators, and a journalist that normally worked to other publications at that time. The ABC has always had a neutral position, especially when we talk about political subjects. But after 1926, military coup politics gained prominence in Portugal, and the magazine supported the military coup, dedicating many covers and pages to the subject. So the idea that the magazine was neutral totally changed after the dictatorship in Portugal. On September 1931, ABC went out of circulation. On Tuesdays, the magazine addressed its readers with a promise that the suspension of the publication would be for a limited period of time, and justified this fact with economic difficulties. So the magazine doesn't say goodbye to the readers, but the truth is that the ABC was never being published again. It was the last issue of the magazine. Now, Domingo Ilustrado. Domingo Ilustrado was a magazine published for 2 years, only 2 years, between January 1925 and December 1927, and it was created as a weekly magazine printed a newsprint paper. It was considered a cheap paper. In its first issue, Domingo Ilustrado said to be a magazine for everybody with diverse content and something more than a daily reportage of the street and far from politics. All the covers and the back covers of the magazine broke an iconography, not a photo, but iconography that represented aspects of the Portuguese society. For example, we have here in the first issue of Domingo Ilustrado, the cover pictures a group of boys coming from a rural area using typical vestments, arrived at home at Lisbon to enlist in the military service. The other image is the back cover, and we can see a story or a representation of problems associated with extreme poverty of the working class. With the title, Stop the Hunger, the illustration represents a group of workers who ask for bread and employment. So one of the characteristics of Domingo Ilustrado was to talk about social issues. In the first issue, we can also read information about the print quality of the magazine and the promise of improvements for the future edition. It said, the system of engravings and design of our magazine will be successively improved. The first number is always the worst. But after 1 year, the magazine wouldn't suffer any change in the graphic quality at all, and it was justified by economic issues. The magazine broke its content, structured predominantly in 4 columns, as we can see here in this image, matching photos and illustration, and with a predominance of illustration, which was a cheaper type of iconography. The photos was too expensive. Most of the photos were the type of portraits identified with subtitles and usually with no identification of the authors, unlike what happened in ABC, which we mentioned before. Although the magazine states to have a neutral position, especially in relation to politics, this attitude changed over time. As we have already mentioned, Portugal went through a period of great political and social unrest that culminated in a dictatorship that would modify several aspects of the lives of the Portuguese, and the magazine didn't have a neutral position. The event of the military coup were highlighted in the cover, and they brought, for example, here we can see the colors of the Portuguese flag and a photo of the General Gomes da Costa, the leader of the movement, accompanied by the sentence, "This man has strength, help this man save Portugal." The magazine was totally in accordance with the new government system. As a strategy to consolidate the readers, Domingo Ilustrado always had as a goal to make then the readers take part in the production of its contents, with the purpose to dialogue with the audience, the readers. The magazine used it to promote contests, for example, to choose the most beautiful actress or to select the best Portuguese football player. The readers could follow the evolution of the contest in the subsequent editions of the magazine, and the results sometimes were published in the cover of the magazine. So it was one of the characteristics. We have several examples of contests during the history of the Domingo Ilustrado. Although we don't have any information about numbers, about the circulation numbers, Domingo Ilustrado had on the top of its cover, about 4 months after its first publication, the information, the highest circulation of the Portuguese magazines. And even though it had its apparent commercial success, at the end of almost 3 years, on the last Sunday of 1927, on Christmas Day, the Domingo Ilustrado published its last issue and addressed itself to the reader for the last time. We can see here the words that the magazine explaining why they are ceasing to be published. We cannot identify the exact reason why Domingo Ilustrado ceased to exist, but the truth is that the Portuguese people, the Portuguese already had other options to choose magazine more sophisticated. As an example, we can say that Illustration is an example, is a more sophisticated magazine, totally different from Domingo Ilustrado. This magazine was launched in January 1926 and was publicized twice per month, printed in luxurious coated paper, and it distinguished itself by coverage of national and foreign official acts in form of news photos. It was presented with a colorful cover, followed by a black and white interior cover, and the last few pages were reserved for advertising. The Illustration had as initial proposal, filling a gap because until then the country didn't have a regular expressive publication in the national and international scene, a more in-depth coverage of the reality than the daily press, and the third objective was to provide a higher quality in what concerned graphic arts. One of the characteristics of Illustration was the photonotices that we can see here in these photos, a section where the most important events, especially those occurring in Lisbon and Porto, were presented through pictures. In this way, it would be the reader to do their own analysis and judgment of the facts. Consequently, the magazine remained away from subjects that could bring some controversy, more specifically political subjects, especially after the institution of the dictatorship, when the magazines, this magazine and the others, didn't have freedom to talk about whatever they want. And this characteristic is one of the reason why the magazine was so successful, because the magazine was away from political subjects. In the first issue of the magazine, in the section Feminina, the Illustration brought a piece with the title Colors and Modern Silhouettes, and they used a very poetic language to talk about the subject. So they are talking about hats and clothes and hair. And in the other image, we can see a totally different example, né? Because she's more traditional subjects, where is slowly given place to other matters, which gave the woman a greater relevance in society. We have as an example reportage from May 1927 with the title, The Woman in the House and in Science. In this piece, we can notice that the magazine was also an important way to stimulate questions about the role of a woman in society, advocate for civil rights and equality between men and women. So it was really interesting to see how the magazine talked about women in the beginning and how this way of talking women changed over time. So we are talking about a magazine from 1927. It was really interesting to see. In 1932, it went through a management change with the arrival of a new director, Antônio Ferro. When Antônio Ferro took the post, the magazine restarted numbering from 1 to mark a new beginning, and we can also notice other changes. For example, the magazine started to be printed 100% in coated paper, which brought a touch of elegance and luxury. In terms of layout and the graphics, the pages were more diverse and with more photos, and the illustration also gained a touch of color. So we can see a big difference between the beginning of the magazine and in this moment, have more colorful, more elegant, more modern. In the last number of the Ilustração, was published in 16 December 1939 with the world already involved in the World War II. The cover we can see here in the image, it's in blue, was in blue, and had a religious theme usual in the month of December. The magazine opened with the phrase, "The war continues with its vast litany of horrors." The colored tone was replaced by the predominance of black and white, matching the war that had long been established as a dominant theme in the page. So the colorful photos and the illustration are totally changed for the black and white, and the main subject of the magazine was the war, everything about war. With the title, The Ilustração and the War, the reason for the temporary suspension of our magazine, the publication said goodbye to its readers with the promise to return. He said, "The Ilustração does not die." This promise would never be fulfilled. The magazine had good acceptance by the public, and it was the paper crisis that was responsible for the disappearance of the Ilustração, and also because of the limitations caused by the war. So thank you so much for your attention. It's everything by now.
Thank you, Soliana, for your presentation filled with amazing illustrations.
You're welcome.
Now, finally, we have the paper Intervalo Magazine, a new way of talking about TV in Brazil in the 1960s by Thalita Magnulo and Cristina Mussa from Federal University of Juiz de Fora, and Thalita will be presenting.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Sorry, Soliana, can you turn the screen on?
I will share as well a PowerPoint presentation with you. Just a second.
Sure.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, perfectly.
Just a moment. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be able to participate in this event. I would like to congratulate the organization of the Congress and also the fact that it turned into a virtual event. For us, it's very good to keep researching and be here. It's very special. The work that I'm going to present to you today is directly related to the research I carried out during my master's degree in communication at Federal University of Juiz de Fora, Brazil, and also with the research I am currently developing in my doctorate. The name of the article is Intervalo Magazine, a new way of talking about TV in Brazil. I prepare a presentation with some images, and I'm also prepare a text so I can be more secure about my English and the time. Okay. Well, my academic research started during my master's degree with the Brazilian magazine Intervalo, published by Abril editors between 1963 and 1972. Intervalo is considered one of the most important and specialized publications that emerged between the 60s and the 70s in Brazil, as it values entirety in television subjects. The inspiration for the launch of Intervalo came from the United States, from one of the most famous magazines of the time, TV Guide, a small format publication which contained all television programs covering the North America continent from coast to coast and all TV stations. This way of communicating TV programming and let the viewer know so that they could follow their favorite shows, movies, and series was bold and innovative. More than offering the TV programming, Intervalo came up with the intention of treating the issues that were on the television in a journalistic way. Thus, the magazine built a very close relationship with TV and changed their way of communication as television has also evolved since the creation of new programs and a new communication strategies. I would like to share with you that this research with Magazine Intervalo would not have been possible without conducting several interviews with former employees of the magazine, since there was not enough information in academic articles, books, or even in the website of Abril Publishing. Using the Paul Thompson's oral history methodology, I managed to gather information about the magazine and rescue its memory. I put some photos here that I gathered with the interviewees. It was a very special moment for me because they were so generous and they really want to participate on my research. The work I submitted to this Congress aimed to understand how the fixed sections of the magazine Intervalo were developed and to learn how the logic of the content production needed to be rethought during the musical effervescence of that period. The present work presents the technical modifications of the magazine that, at that moment, behaved as a disseminator of the new media products and television content. While the radio brought out the voices and in a way touched the imagination of its listeners, the cinema brought the image. According to Rousseau, cinema, which brought the representation of reality with moving images, was one of the most exciting creations from the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. Upon arriving in Brazil, it scared the population, provoked adverse reactions until, over time, it fell into the popular taste. The new art gained status within the cultural industry and shared new modes of communication with the printed media. The Cinelândia magazine, for example, was a publication directed to the cinema, both Brazilian and Hollywood, which circulated between the 40s and the 50s, and its covers were printed with photos of actors, both local and international, who were successful at the time. The period between 1945 and 1955 symbolized the heyday of radio in Latin America. According to Royce and Embach, this was the time for auditorial programs, radio soap operas, the popularization of artists, singers, and broadcasters, and also the great investment in advertising funds for the most popular mass media so far. It was a moment of great editorial effervescence, from which countless radio magazines emerged across the continent. Until the 50s, radio was the main source of information and entertainment for the population in Brazil, until the arrival of television in the early 50s with the opening of TV Tupi. In general, the magazines that talked about radio provoked in their readers the feeling of participating in the backstage of the stations and the intimacy of the radiocasts. On the radio, music of different genres were heard, news from Brazil and the world, adventure series, sung commercials, soap operas, comedy programs, sport broadcasters, among others. The arrival of TV made the radio recognize the influence of this new means of mass communication. This can be seen when just below the title of Revista do Rádio magazine, the phrase "the first in radio and television" started to appear. And in 1959, for example, the title of the publication became Revista do Rádio e TV, as the number of the articles on television grew. Another change over the 60s was the space that the new manifestations of Brazilian popular music, such as bossa nova, festivals, and Jovem Guarda, gained in the publication in detriment of the traditional radio singers. At that time, magazines also appear that have their editorial line entirely directed to television, such as, for example, Sete Dias na TV, launched in the early 50s and considered a pioneer when dealing with issues related to television. The pioneering spirit is due to the fact that the magazine tried to bring television programming. However, it was overturned by Intervalo, which, in addition to bringing programming from all over Brazil, innovated in the way of communicating with its reading public and talking about TV. Another publication that was also a pioneer and that, like the other two mentioned, brought the TV programming printed was TV Programas, launched in 1955, however, with one difference. The weekly only circulated in a state of Paraná and consequently brought up issues about the local television. Intervalo magazine is considered one of the most important specialized publications that appeared between the 60s and the 70s, as it fully valued subjects and themes about television throughout Brazil. The magazine was intended for television lovers. According to Jaime Figueroa, one of the first employees of the art department of Intervalo, who worked on the magazine between 63 and 66, the magazine was for people who had TV set at home and who used the magazine to stay informed about the schedule. For those who didn't have the TV, it was an option to see what happened during the week in an easy and inexpensive way to have an eye contact with their favorite artists and singers. It can be said that the development of TV brought about several changes and technical improvements, giving rise to a new way of communicating and talking about what happened in the media. The impact for magazines that talked about television at the time were very great because while TV was new in Brazil, writing about TV and covering programs were also a significant novelty. The magazine had some fixed sections, among them Intervalo para Conversa, Intervalo for Conversation, which was a page with passages from letters sent by readers. The letters usually brought praise to the magazine and also questions about an actor and singer. Other times they brought comments about a recent event. In addition to the readers' letter sections, the magazine also included o que eles disseram, what did they say, which worked according to the logic of the readers' letters, only they were the artist speeches regarding a certain program, event, or TV star. Another section that brought a lot of information was Jornal da TV, TV's journal, which reported on all programs from all broadcasters in Brazil, also in a form of small notes and with some highlights according to what was most seen or commented along the week. The magazine had no proposal to position itself politically. However, this does not mean that it remained completely impartial in relation to the world of TV. In its sections, Bola Branca, Bola Preta, White Ball, Black Ball, the magazine made minor reservations, both positive, white ball, and negative, black ball, regarding what was happening on television. The confidential section was one of the most controversial of the magazine, whose main proposal was to reveal information, gossip, and secrets that until then were kept confidential. Keeping its identity with the other sections, this one also brought up issues related to artists, singers, directors, TV stations, and events of the week. The texts were presented in small notes, with one difference, however. The notes that the magazine considered most important came in capital letters, consequently gaining more prominence on the page. In this article, we were able to perceive and understand the importance that the media had for specialized magazines, going through radio and cinema until arriving magazines about TV. Furthermore, it is possible to observe that, with the arrival of television in Brazil, the communicational logic had to be rethought, not only from a technological point of view, but also relates to the creation of a new grid of programs and strategies to conquer and please a viewer audience that was forming in the time. For the printed media, it was no different. All the difficulties faced during the period of development of television were reflected in the production of printed content that needed to be rethought and elaborated according to the TV. We could observe that one of the strategies adopted was the creation of the fixed sections that, in a way, already mentioned the programs, the rising stars, the recent events, and other things. Even though each section had a different purpose, from presenting the opinion of its readers, talking about the secrets of celebrities, praising a program, presenting the most watched programs or the best-selling records, all of them were at the heart of television. For this article, it is worth mentioning the importance of the Intervalo for Conversations section, which gave voice to the magazine's readers and allowed a more direct interaction with the magazine and, consequently, the television world, since the weekly had the habit to answer the readers, turning the section into a place for conversation between friends. The interviews also showed us a great emotional involvement on the part of the interviewees, who all times affirmed that the union, boldness, and joy of the newsroom made all the difference for the magazine Intervalo, which positioned itself as the first weekly print to bring television programming from all over the country and for all channels. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your insightful presentation. Now we will start with the questions. We had a lot of questions during your presentations. I will ask all presenters to turn on their cameras, please. So, can we start with a question from Tim Holmes to Catherine? Tim highlighted the opportunity that global research on the topic of farm magazines has. And he asks if you are going to be doing any more research in this sector, and if you would recommend it as a research area for others. Catherine, please.
Sure. Tim, thank you for the question. So specific to the agricultural revolutions in the UK, I am not doing specific research in that area. I would agree with you. There's all kinds of additional research that could be done in this general area. So what I've been working on right now is actually doing some content analyses of US magazines. So I'm actually presenting later this summer research on a content analysis of cover images and representations of women from the Farm Journal and successful farming throughout the 20th century. And I'm working on a content analysis of images throughout the magazines, because especially early in the 20th century, there were women's sections within the magazines and family sections within the magazines. So I'm looking at the upcoming content analysis that I'm working on looks at representations of women in particular throughout the magazines. And then moving forward from there, I also want to look at more of a qualitative analysis of what various people, so again, sticking with the imagery in the magazines, qualitative analysis of what kinds of things are people doing. So not only are they represented or aren't they represented, but what, from a qualitative standpoint, what is that suggesting about the roles, gender-specific roles in farming? Because even farming data, like government data from the 20th century, underrepresents the roles of women on farms in terms of leadership roles and things like that. So there's an entire segment of research that I am currently working on, but you're absolutely right, Tim. There's a broad swath of future research that could be done.
Thank you, Catherine. I also have a question for you. I saw some schematics on the examples you included in your presentation, and being a researcher on information visualization and infographics, I'm curious about what role did visuals and instructionable images played in the publications you studied, especially in the ones from the beginning of the 20th century.
Sure. So actually, early in the 20th century, the magazines would, as I guess we would expect, were far more heavily text-based than illustration-based. E.T. Meredith, the founder of Successful Farming, actually spent quite a bit of money early in the history of the magazine commissioning gorgeous cover illustrations. So money was spent there. But in terms of the internal editorial pages, those were mostly text-based early on. There were some illustration, and certainly over the years, the illustrations, the number of illustrations, the quality of illustrations, and then photos increased in the magazines, where you would see illustration from the very beginning were in the advertisements. So the editorial would be running text. The advertisements would have illustrations of the latest, gadgets and all of that sort of thing. And then, like I said, moving forward, you would see more illustration and more photography in editorial as the 20th century progressed. And I would say starting in the late 1960s, when the magazines really became more big ag focused and more of a business publication, then there were fewer, they're trended towards more text and fewer images, although, again, the ease of taking photos was certainly far easier. So it was, from that standpoint, more than earlier.
Thank you so much. Now we have a question from Mary for Sharon. The question is, do you think Vegetarian Times could have been saved? And if so, how?
That's such a good question. And it has to do with that issue of who you serve, right? So what happened with Veg Times was it was sold to a succession of corporate owners who watered down the editorial content quite deliberately in an effort to gain a mass market appeal. So it went from vegetarianism to meatless eating, right? And it lost a lot of the people who were looking for a True Believer magazine of that sort to all the vegan magazines, right? And so could it have been saved? It's hard to answer that exactly because there's two things going on simultaneously. It's losing its autonomy and it's losing its mission. And both were hazardous, but it definitely lost its mission. And it just became something that was no longer needed by anybody. So probably the way it would have been saved would have been had after some corporate owners, it at one point re-achieved its independence. Had it at that point recaptured a mission and asserted that with authority, perhaps it could have been saved. But that is not at all what happened.
Thank you. We also have a question from Tim. He asked if there is anything similar happening with the vegan titles.
I'm not sure I feel fully qualified to answer that, but there are a lot of them and they're strong, and they're also very strong in the digital space and in, they're more contemporary. But I don't have any information about circulation and revenue and stuff like that for the vegan titles.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Tim to Ciliana. He asks if there is any evidence that these magazines with their advanced graphics had an influence on other printed material, including newspapers.
Yes, it's a very good question. Thank you so much. But I don't have any information about that. To answer this question, it was necessary to research the newspapers, the contemporary newspaper from that moment, and but it's a very good question because when they change something in graphics and the layout, they are always saying, the magazine are saying that it's modern. We are the first in Portugal that we are starting with this new technology. So maybe it was an influence in the older magazines or even in newspapers. It's interesting too because some of these magazines, for example, Domingo Ilustrado, identified itself as a journal, as a newspaper. But today we can analyze the characteristics and identify as a magazine. So in that moment, it's not so clear the differences between a magazine and a newspaper. So it could be an influence for sure.
Thank you so much, Ciliana. Carla Cardoso has an open question that arises from Ciliana's presentation, but any of the presenters can comment. And the question is, in Portugal, many magazines disappear without saying goodbye to their readers. Does the same happen in other countries?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's not the case of these three magazines because they said goodbye, and with the promise that is going to be published again, what never happened. But yes, for example, Flama is another magazine that started being published in 1937 to 1976 and had as a characteristic a very close dialogue with the readers and have some differences, some novelty, some change, is always talking about the reading. We are going to change, we have more color, more pages, etc. And one day simply disappeared. It was really, really, really frustrating. Flama was more contemporary, so we could find some interviews from journalists who was working at the magazine at that time that could explain, give some information about that. But in the cases of the magazine that I presented today that have 100 years ago, it's not possible to interview anyone. So we can guess, especially problems related with economic issues, the paper crisis, or some consequences from the World War II or the First World War. It's something that I can guess, but in the reality, we will never know for sure the reason why the magazine stopped being published.
Do any of the other presenters want to tell us about the reality they found in their countries? Sorry, Talita, I will have to unmute you.
I'm sorry.
No.
I wrote here, here in Brazil, we have this happened a lot in the past because all the editors were more interested in launch new magazines that were more successful and everything. With Abril, for example, I have with me the last number of Intervalo magazine, and they didn't say any moment that the magazine was in the end or the magazine want to be continuous, because they were launching Veja magazine. I don't know if you are familiar with this title. It's a very famous magazine here in Brazil, and they put all their sources in the Veja magazine and they simply ended Intervalo. So I do believe that happened with more magazines, because during the 60s and the 70s, there were the launch of a lot of magazines. So probably happened more than one time.
Boy, the US is a pretty big place with a lot of different models. Catherine, I'll start, maybe you can piggyback on this and fill it in. But there's a long history of magazines in the US getting skinnier because they're so advertising dependent. So fewer and fewer pages, maybe going from monthly to bi-monthly, so lowering frequency before actually closing. As to the question of whether they say goodbye, I feel like I've seen a lot of those goodbyes, but in recent years, a lot of those goodbyes have been online, right? You, not necessarily in the pages. Do you want to add any value to, I'm not sure how valuable that was. Oh, Catherine also needs to be unmuted by the host, I think.
There we go. Now I can jump in. Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, I would second what you said. The reason I didn't jump in to begin with is we have so many magazines and we're so big and broad that it really depends. So to piggyback on what Sharon said, we've also seen quite a number of titles shift to digital only. And so there's the trend, as Sharon mentioned, that the magazine gets skinnier and the print magazine gets skinnier and skinnier. And I think that has definitely become a warning sign to readers, subscribers that, maybe my title is in trouble. And then there is a point where a number of those have been shifted to digital only properties. Or as we've seen consolidation with some of the big ones, titles have gotten combined with other titles, or the more popular, I know Meredith has been doing this, and I can't speak to specific titles, but when Meredith bought out Time Inc. and has acquired other properties, they will look at which of two competing titles is the one that makes sense to keep moving forward, and the other one then perhaps closes. And so there might be some elements of that one that goes. I think, but same as several people have commented in terms of editors being able to say goodbye. I think Sharon mentioned a lot of times that happens online. I think when there's an opportunity, as Tim mentioned in the comments, certainly editors take the opportunity, if there is one, to say goodbye in an editor's letter. But sometimes the decision is announced between issues or something like that, where an editor doesn't have an opportunity, within the magazine, but so that announcement is made online. And so it has become recently very easy for editors to be able to speak to audiences because of digital and social opportunities.
And the other thing, I'll just add one quick more thing, which is that, thank you, that was perfect, is that in the instances where a parent company of the magazine is closing the magazine and you have subscribers who've signed on for a certain number of issues, they'll commonly fulfill the rest of the subscription with another magazine, kind of trying to flip you onto another magazine in their portfolio.
Thank you so much. Now we have a question from Tim to Talita. Tim is curious to know what was the mix of editorial and listings of schedules in the magazines you studied?
It's great. I can show you because I think it's going to be better. This was Intervalo magazine. As you can see, a small format magazine. And just for curiosity, I know that's not the topic. These were TV Guide. So we can see that they are very similar in size and the title and colors and kind of the photo and everything. But the interesting thing is that in the magazine, we have the schedule of the programs. So here we have the day of the week and the programs and the channels that were with them. And they have other things. For example, they did some texts with photographs. They had some interviews. But the most special thing in this first moment of Intervalo magazine, it was the TV programming, because here in Brazil, it was the novelty. So as the television built the programs and create the grid of the hours and the channels, the magazine accompanied the programs and put here in the magazine, but also with other things. Here, for example, we have another example of Jornal da TV. I don't know if it's what he asked, but it was a great mix, but everything was focused on television. And just answering him about my mom and my dad, we have a long tradition, so they be present during my presentations and they are here cheering, but they are not used to the virtual events, so they were walking around. I'm sorry about this.
No problem at all. I bet they enjoyed your presentation as much as we did. Well, I think we don't have any more questions. If there aren't any, I will close this session. A special thanks to all of the presenters for their insightful presentations, and all of the members of the audience for participating in the session. There was a lot of comments during your presentations, following the questions also. Now I'll give the word to Carla to close day one of Mapping the Magazine.
Thanks to everybody, like we are already doing on the chat right now, and see you tomorrow, because it has been a great day, a great first day. So tomorrow is even going to be better. Okay. Don't forget the talking circle, send us ideas, come and we'll discuss the future and the present and everything else that we want, because this is really a fascinating world. See you tomorrow. Bye bye, dears.